Book launch of White Women Get Ready, and we're pleased to have Amanda Gross all the way from Harrisonburg, Virginia, join us tonight. We also want to welcome those who are streaming online tonight. We look forward to the conversation. There will be opportunities for those of you online to indicate your name, location, let us know what your questions are, as Amanda is going to be inviting our responses. We're grateful to the Common Word and Arlen for organizing this event tonight with us. And the conversation will be recorded for kind of your future, but for others to also get that at Common Word. There will be a book signing also at the end of the evening. So like unsettling the settlers within, it feels like Amanda's work is provocative. So when we notice our own tensions and stress levels increasing because of her challenge, let us remember to breathe together. We breathe to center and ground ourselves and remind ourselves of the connection to our Creator. And tonight, as people of privilege and latecomers on this land, we acknowledge the First Peoples who have been caretakers of this land and protectors of our watersheds for so long. The lands of Treaty 1 are the ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Oji-Cree, the Dakota, the Dene, and the homeland of the Red River Métis. And together, let us commit to remembering, re-educating, and taking action in an effort to repair the harm, and not be afraid to implicate ourselves in our truth-telling. Grateful to a friend of Jonathan and mine, Melanie Neufeld, Cameron Alterez, for connecting us to Amanda. Cameron and Carol Penner together edited this book called Resistance. So I've not read Amanda's book, but I've read her chapter in this book. So I'm gonna give you a couple of hints as far as some of the themes that Amanda focuses on. She speaks to themes that are important to many of us in Manitoba, calling us to confront colonialism and the need for reconciliation with Indigenous people. And she asks questions that may echo some of our own. And here she writes, I want to know this. How do we get stuck in a narrative of heroic victimhood? How has that created a sense of entitlement to the lands we have come to occupy? How does our repressed pride in 500 years of martyr identity block us from healing? How have we used chosen trauma and chosen glory to justify acts of structural and cultural violence against others in order to gain back the safety in our homelands that was once lost? She invites us to practice a different way, a truth-telling that implicates ourselves. Here's another quote, the time has come to practice. Those of us who are Mennonites of European descent have spent centuries considering the weight of our oppression. What now does it mean to consider the weight of being the oppressor? What now are the movements we need to make to stop and repair the abuse? How do we tell our truths in ways that intentionally implicate ourselves? What are the daily practices that decenter our future existence as colonizers on this land? Amanda, has insight into our developed habits of Mennonite exceptionalism and a deep understanding of intergenerational trauma. Amanda's work integrates an embodied practice as a yoga instructor and as an anti-racist organizer. Tonight, we expect a more specific call to white women to wake up, to get ready, and stop upholding systems of oppression. Rather work to upend structures of violence. May that be our call tonight. Thanks, Amanda, for being with us, and I look forward to you sharing with us.
Thanks, Melanie. Hi, everyone. Good evening. Can you hear me okay? Okay. I'm Amanda K. Gross. The K stands for Catherine. I've been teaching an online class for the Winnipeg Holistic Expressive Arts Therapy Institute for about 4 years, but I've never been to this space. So this is really a wonderful point of connection and homecoming. I also didn't realize that there are some people that I know from 25 years ago who live here. So I got the opportunity to have dinner with some old friends. Thank you, Melanie, for that introduction. I do have a background in anti-racist Raja Yoga, and so I will be inviting us to be in our bodies at different points throughout my talk. I also don't love lectures, giving them or sitting in a lecture, so we're gonna have an interactive part of our time together where y'all will get to work too. So to start, I'm gonna invite you to kind of shake a little bit, find a little wiggle, maybe in your fingers or your toes, your jaw. Stick out your tongue. Scrunch up your face. Maybe bring your arms up in the air, shake your hands, wiggle. Also, if you need to use the bathroom, washroom, I don't know where that is. They're that way. And if you have water, a reminder to drink it. Great. So, I am someone who was born and raised in a Mennonite family and in a Mennonite church, yet I was often in settings in which I was the only Mennonite. Over those years, shaped by not one, but 2 Atlanta, Georgia area Mennonite church communities, and by my Swiss German Mennonite family at home, I got plenty of practice providing context for my confused and often curious classmates and friends. What's a Mennonite? They would ask. Top of my list was the Anabaptist teaching on nonviolence. Yet, as I got older, I realized that violence wasn't just fist fights and military occupations. Violence included structural, systemic, and state oppression. Being committed to peace thus necessitated a commitment to resisting and ending violence in all of its forms, including racism, sexism, transphobia, colonization, and the list goes on. These systems of dominance reinforce cultural, systemic, and state-sanctioned violence. I'm also a visual artist, so the images that you'll be seeing are from pieces of art that I've made. I was born into white ladydom, given a race and a gender in an Atlanta hospital in the early 1980s. Along with my name, pink dresses, which I still love, and Cabbage Patch dolls, there were immediate references to dating, jokes that boys better stay away, and hypothesizing about how my future feminine sexuality would be fortified, kept pure while waiting for the one right man to come along. I grew up a good little white girl, groomed to play by the rules and win, or at least to maintain the flawless and effortless appearance that I was. And when occasionally I wasn't winning, my white lady mama would go remind the system that I was supposed to. At the same time that I was being conditioned to win at the perfect grade, the perfect body, and the perfect attitude, I was also conditioned to help, support, defend, and ultimately defer my self-interest to God, the Father, men, almost always white, including my actual father, and the church family. If not actually white in the pews, the dominant cultural norms, elevated history, and power seat of the Mennonite church I grew up in remain steeped in whiteness. There is an 1,100-page book to this effect titled The Martyr's Mirror. Maybe you've heard of it, which outlines approximately 17 centuries of dying for the cause with illustrations. These stories of persecution and sacrifice became part of my cultural and religious vocabulary during Congressional Children's Story Hour when I was first introduced to the martyred stories of my ancestors. I was 4. And yet, my Mennonite ancestors weren't the only Europeans with tales of historical traumas. Many North Americans of European descent have likewise been connected to traumatic legacies, whether or not they have personal access to those specific stories. European people groups often left Europe for a variety of traumatic and life-threatening reasons. Many have ancestry in the peasantry and indentured servants who were expelled as class prisoners, or in Jewish and other religious communities who faced widespread terror and extermination from hundreds of years of state-sanctioned violence, or in European indigenous people groups who had been colonized for generations, like the Irish or the Catalans, or in more recent immigrant communities fleeing poverty, the world wars, and fascism of 20th century Europe. For thousands of years, Europeans brutalized each other, kicked each other out of their homes, and sent each other to perish oceans away. No wonder we have culturally internalized so much fear. What is often not talked about is how centuries of traumas traveling within the bodies of Europeans, in muscle memory, through DNA, and in dreams. Imagine all that unmetabolized, historical, multi-generational trauma, filling up boat after boat as Europeans set sail for what they later classified as the Americas, as well as the continents of Africa, Asia, and Australia. Understanding and healing trauma, then, is such an important tool for interrupting and preventing violence and for moving towards repair, justice, and transformation of these insidious systemic harms. Trauma is not just a static thing that individual victims experience, but a collective dynamic that whole societies and communities navigate, including those responsible for the traumatic events. We are all connected. Dr. Joy DeGruy's book, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, was one of the first places I learned about the interlocking traumas of victims and perpetrators, the oppressed and the oppressors. Dr. Joy writes, "These crimes are perpetrated in a seemingly never-ending cycle. For who can be truly human under the weight of oppression that condemns them to a life of torment, robs them of a future, and saps their free will? Moreover, who can become truly human when they gain so much from the pain and suffering of those whom they oppress and/or take advantage of?" Dr. Joy's groundbreaking work describes post-traumatic slave syndrome as, quote, "a condition that exists when a population has experienced multi-generational trauma resulting from centuries of slavery and continues to experience oppression and institutionalized racism today." Dr. Joy later posits that white people have also been impacted by this legacy of multi-generational violence, racial superiority, and the justification of 500 years of trauma and dehumanization that Europeans and their descendants and their institutions produced. So to paraphrase Dr. Joy, if there is a post-traumatic slave syndrome, then there also must be a post-traumatic master syndrome. Or, to apply Rachel McNair's perpetration-induced traumatic stress, post-traumatic master syndrome speaks to the psychological consequences of violence against human beings on the people perpetrating the violence. When I asked a friend and colleague where I could find this book on post-traumatic master syndrome, he told me it was mine to write. This book is me accepting his challenge, with one important modification. Post-traumatic master syndrome is not entirely mine to write, but a very interconnected piece of it, post-traumatic mistress syndrome, most definitely is. There is a personally specific way that I have been colluding with whiteness that comes out of my own unique human story, yet cannot be detached from the story of other white folks. I am a status quo passing, white Swiss German Mennonite lady who grew up in Atlanta, Georgia. Chances are you're not. But if you are alive today, especially if you've been racialized as white, and especially if you've navigated white girlhood or white womanhood at any point in your life, then post-traumatic mistress syndrome has something to say about your story. Before we get more specific about the interlocking trauma of post-traumatic mistress syndrome and how white women are complicit and harmed by these systems, we're going to do an interactive bit. So if you have something to write on and write with, I invite you to take it out. If not, that's okay. We'll work together. And if you have paper, I'm going to invite you to draw 4 capital letter Ds nested one within another. Actually, if you don't have paper, maybe you could figure out what resources exist within this community and access some paper. I'm a community organizer. This is part of organizing. So let's make sure everyone in the room has access to something to write on and something to write with. Are we good? Okay. So these 4 nested capital letter Ds. Two S's? Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so these 4 Ds stand for defensiveness, denial, distancing, and deference. And I've been playing, sometimes I exchange dissociation for distancing because denial is the flight response rather than distancing. That can be confusing. So whichever of these make more sense for you. So who here has ever had a conversation about race or colonialism and encountered defensiveness or denial? Yeah? The question is in myself or in someone else? Either or, yeah? Okay. What does it look like? What does defensiveness look like? What's an example of that? That wasn't me. It's not what I meant. Mm-hmm. Oh, how dare you even ask that question? I'm not racist. Mm-hmm.
Other people are doing worse things.
Oh, okay. Other people are doing worse things. Yeah. Any other justifications you might hear, specifically to this context, because I'm learning about racism in Canada from you all. Oh, yeah, nobody was here. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You misunderstood me.
You misunderstood me. So turning it back around. What is the body language when either you feel defensive or you experience that in somebody else? Can you show me what the posture is? I see some arms crossed, hands on the hips, shoulders up. Sitting back. Yeah? What about denial? What would be an example of denial in those conversations about race and colonialism?
You're making too big a deal of it.
Okay. Minimizing it, you're making too big a deal.
It's not really there the way you think so.
Mm-hmm. It's not really there. Denial can be tricky because how do we know when we're in denial? Sometimes it takes a pretty severe moment.
That was my ancestors,
That was my ancestors. Sometimes denial is silence, right?
You're too sensitive?
You're too sensitive. What about distancing? And here I mean dissociation. So if defensiveness is the fight response and denial is the flight response, then dissociation or distancing is our freeze response. So the distancing is internal, right? It's like cutting off from emotions, from the body, going into the head, intellectualizing. What would be an example of that distancing or dissociation, either from your own experience or something that you've witnessed?
Occupy yourself with another activity.
It's like distraction. Yes. We don't talk about it, or maybe even not saying that, but just not talking about it. And this can happen in the body, right? So I, about 7 or 8 years ago, I was at the farmer's market in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I was having a conversation with a fiber art friend. I'm a hand weaver. And out of the blue, she made this racist remark. And it caught me off guard. It was a beautiful day at the farmer's market. It was sunny. And I'm like, okay, that's not okay. And so I go into my head. I freeze. I didn't have any words. And I go into my head to try to think of, like, what do I need to do to respond? And by the time I came up with something, the moment had passed. Like, she had moved on. So this can be like a literal freeze, distancing. I went into my head, and I wasn't able to respond in the moment. Deference, if we're talking about trauma responses, we have fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. What is fawn?
You laugh at the joke and you're not sure what else to do.
Okay, so laughing, going along with the joke, could be a fawn response. That deference to defer. Any other examples? It only happened once, it won't happen again. So like minimizing it, again, is what I hear. Yeah. Changing the subject. Crying. I think that deference, this has been what white women have used in order to stay in proximity to power, to keep ourselves and our children relatively safe and not address things. So the question for you, all humans are navigating this in some way, right? Like, our bodies learn these trauma responses because we feel under threat. Our bodies feel under threat. Now, often, especially in the case of white-bodied folks, we are not in physical danger, right? But we still act like that defensive, that fight response comes up. Someone's physiological response, their bodies feel like they're under threat, even though they're obviously not under threat. So, what is your go-to in the context of a conversation around race and colonization of these four? That's our question. So pick a specific context. Like, it might be different in your family system as it is when you're at work. But which of these is your go-to when you get really activated, when your body thinks it's under threat? And it may be under threat, right, depending on the situation. So we don't want to minimize that. But which is your go-to, and in what context? And then you're going to find a partner to talk about it with. Yeah? Any questions? Okay, let's take like 4 minutes to do this. Which is your go-to, in what context? make sure all folks in your pair or triad get a chance to share. So let's come back together. What you have is all right. So it sounds like you came up with some things. So the next question is, how do you know when it's happening? What goes on in your body specifically when your go-to occurs? You feel hot. Which was your go-to of the 4Ds that you talked about? Okay, one of these, but you feel hot. What another example of how does it feel in your body?
I feel a lot of adrenaline.
Adrenaline. What does that feel like in your body? What does your body do? So it's like you take a breath in, but I'm seeing that your air is going to the top of your lungs. It's not down here. It's kind of all coming up here. Yeah? The energy is rising. One more example of what happens in your body. How do you know when it's happening?
My breathing cuts off and I restrict.
Yeah, you restrict your breath. Which of the 4Ds were you working with? Freeze. Okay, right. So it's all going to be different bodies. It's going to be different for you. But can you notice when it's happening and get as specific as you can to what's happening in your body? And then what is one thing you can do in the moment when it's happening to support yourself for your body, right? So there are things we can do to prevent before as part of our, ongoing, how do we take care of ourselves? Maybe you're at work, an incident happens, can't go take a bubble bath. What are you going to do in the moment when what's accessible to you in that moment, like for real? Can you chug water? Can you take a deep breath? Maybe you do need to remove yourself from the space. So that's that's two things for you to think about. How do you know when it's happening? How does it show up in your body? And what is one thing that you can do when it happens? So the invitation for the rest of our next half an hour is for you to see if you can apply this. Can you notice if any of these are coming up for you and what's happening in your body? And can you offer your body something? Yeah? So I want to let's just do one breath together. This is one of my favorites. Apologies to you if you have a bee allergy. It's called bee breath. And so we're going to breathe in through the nose, and then we're going to buzz out like a bee. Yeah? So you can try it. Anything I offer is a suggestion. If it doesn't work for you, please don't do it. So breath in through the nose, and buzz out like a bee. And then the scope of my book is looking at, so where did these traumas come from and how do they show up today? One of the questions that I pose specifically is what created the environment for settler colonization? What was happening in Europe? What Linda Highway Smith calls the imperialist imagination. What systemic harms were already being perpetuated in Europe before global colonization? Along with religious oppression and class hierarchies, for several thousands of years, patriarchy was the dominant system for classifying, organizing, and rating humans across Europe. In Chapter 2, I get into some of this history, and I'm referring a lot to Silvia Federici's book, Caliban and the Witch, about the way the witch hunts used a form of divide and conquer to set peasants against each other. European poor and older women were key targets because their role as community leaders and keepers of cultural memory made them a threat to the European ruling class and land consolidation. The witch hunts make up a gruesome era that demonized feminine power and spirituality, criminalized reproductive choices and bodily autonomy, and resulted in a deepened misogyny and devaluation of reproductive and emotional labor, or things that would go on to be classified as women's work. The rhetoric of colonization of European nation-states as the divinely appointed rulers of indigenous nations was mirrored by the male-headed nuclear family structures that emerged at this time. Christian Ortiz talks about how patriarchy was globalized through colonization, carried on ships and written into law by empires that understood the control of women as essential to the control of land and people. Historian Kathleen M. Brown, in her book, this is one of my favorite book titles of all time, Good Wives, Nasty Wenches, and Anxious Patriarchs, Kathleen M. Brown writes about how a specific pathway began to be carved out for European women who would soon be called white, to having this good wife status, while the animosity and persecution of the witch hunts would get transferred onto non-European, non-white women. Silence as survival, deference to keep safe. How did the unacknowledged, unreckoned with trauma of the witch hunts, the survivor's guilt, and unmetabolized terror lead us to the specific colonial role carved out for settler white women, to become pioneer women, the beacons of civilization, the great white mother, the 1950s housewife, and the trad wives of today? On the antebellum plantation, enslavement had been justified through a paternalistic narrative in which elite white women were responsible for the order of the household. Such order was maintained through the relentless use of psychological and physical violence for the purpose of civilizing those they enslaved, including children. This contrived role as civilizer, domestic manager, and tough love disciplinarian set a maternalistic precedent for helping, fixing, and saving in the name of racism. As the US Civil War ended and enslaved people were no longer available to manage, as in the case of elite Southern white women, or save from slavery for people up north, white women were promoted out of the home and into a more public role. Around the same time, the suffragist movement was gaining momentum from white women's newfound access to public spheres and was strengthened by appropriating Abraham Lincoln's white male liberator into one of the white female civilizer. This included white women's role in the forced education of indigenous children through boarding schools and through a descent in droves by northern white women to educate black children in the South. During this era, the term Great Mother, referencing Queen Victoria, was invoked within the parlance of treaty negotiations between Great Britain and First Nations people in Canada. Similar to the Great White Father references in the US, this relational styling signaled to Indigenous people that there had been created an irrevocable, perpetual familial relationship with the British Crown, based on concepts, principles, and laws defined in Cree as Wakatoan. Am I saying that right? Do you all know? Wakotoan? Thank you, Darcy. Or good relationships. As the Manitoba Historical Society Archives notes, the mother-child relationship within Cree culture is characterized by mutual respect and reciprocal duties of nurturing, care, loyalty, and fidelity. Needless to say, mutual respect and reciprocity was not what the imperial imagination had in mind in its maternalistic, paternalistic conceptualization of these terms. Elevating female power without disrupting the racial hierarchy was tricky business for suffragettes of the day. I meant to change the slide. Late 19th century concepts of white superiority relied on the hierarchy of sexual difference as modeled by the more civilized white race, just as Europeans had relied on the imposition of patriarchal structures as a foundation of colonization. Thus, developing a maternalistic niche was key to white women's reassurance that increasing the similarity of activities performed by themselves and white men would not bring about racial degeneration or undermine their own racialized conception of themselves as belonging to a superior race and civilization. The suffragist movement advocated for the rights of women to vote and hold elected office. Historian Louise Michelle Newman provides an in-depth study of the ways in which the movement for the universal suffrage, or franchise of women, was in fact a quest on behalf of white women, more often than not at the direct expense of non-white people and non-white women in particular. This trend in white supremacy was consistent with its predecessor, the abolitionist movement of the early 1800s. Even while working towards the abolition of slavery, most white abolitionists did not necessarily believe in the full and equal humanity of those who were enslaved. This became especially obvious when suffrage for Black men became a real possibility, prompting several prominent white abolitionist women to threaten to go against the cause unless they were also granted the vote. Still others rejected suffrage for Black men outright based on perceptions of Black inferiority. By contrast, as Newman notes, Black women who still advocated for women's suffrage did not view Black men's suffrage as a threat to their own status, but rather a clear gain for their families and communities and a clear gain for them. Similar to the women's suffrage movement in the US, in Canada, early suffragists were typically white, middle-class women and advocated against non-white women getting the vote. Here in Western Canada, the greater openness to women's suffrage can be interpreted as strategic to the project of settler colonialism. Newly settled regions relied on white settler women to guarantee the displacement of Indigenous peoples. The vote attracted and rewarded white newcomers and was based in notions of white superiority, which persisted as voter policy well into the 20th century. Asian women and men did not get the vote until 1948. Until 1951, the Indian Act also barred many Indigenous women from voting for or holding office in their bands, and in some places, it was not until the 1960s that Indigenous people gained the franchise. So let's take a moment and notice what's happening in your body right now. It is clear that women organized with each other to increase collective power within a racialized hierarchy. Along with their organizations, historian Newman provides several self-proclaimed white lady saviors, including Alice Fletcher, who fled the confines of patriarchal, constructed white womanhood in order to interfere with the lives of the people on the Omaha Reservation. Connected to the Women's National Indian Association, Fletcher became a rare female appointment to the U.S. Department of the Interior as a special agent and scientific expert on the Omaha and Nez Perce people. In 1883, Fletcher advocated for giving out individual allotments to members of the Omaha Nation, rather than keeping the land held collectively, as the Omaha had done. Convinced that this strategy would civilize the Omaha and instill in them a monogamous patriarchal nuclear family structure, Fletcher tried to sell it to the tribe. When it became clear she didn't have their support, Fletcher reached for white supremacy's reinforcement arm, having the reservation police round up the resistors, force them to appear before her, and compel them to make their mark in the presence of witnesses indicating that they accepted a designated piece of land. Unfortunately, Fletcher was only one of many such white ladies at this time who used the savior mindset to influence U.S. Native American policy. We know as well that here in the Canadian context, white women played key roles in administering the violence of Indigenous boarding schools and the 60s scoop through both the child welfare system and white middle-class family systems. So in a span of 200 years, organized women had transitioned from being European patriarchy's public enemy number one to its most sophisticated savior. Rather than fighting the paternalistic control that kept white women restricted and identifying with the history of land enclosures in Europe that persecuted her ancestors, Fletcher used those same wicked webs to maternalistically oppress the Omaha people, among others. After being excluded from the European power structures of church and state for thousands of years, white women in the US and Canada suddenly had been granted a seat at the table of patriarchal power. Something happened between the peak of the witch hunts and the debut of the White Lady Savior. Something changed for the European women who arrived in the 13 colonies that shifted their position of lowly laborer, harlot, and witch into the model of womanhood and mother of civilization. Essential for Fletcher's access to law enforcement, this transition from victim to savior lay in the construction of whiteness. Over the course of the 20th century, the influence white women had in the body politic only continued to grow. According to author Elizabeth Gillespie McCrae, in the 1920s, quote, white supremacy became bureaucratized into a new social welfare infrastructure, and white women regulated intimate matters with the legitimacy of state sanction. In doing so, this new cadre of female workers translated their gender-specific authority as white mothers into public authority as workers for the state. The fields of education, social work, and health and human services are now dominated by white women. Let's take a deep breath in and a long breath out. Like in the plantation system, women and children of color are highly susceptible to the daily racism of white women, precisely because of our overrepresentation in the institutions of their lives. As classroom teachers, caseworkers, counselors, healthcare workers, we statistically disproportionately suspend and expel students of color, while disproportionately advantaging white students through academic tracking, magnet gifted programs. And it's not just the ways we may single out Black and Indigenous children for punishment. It's also the ways we may criminalize their families. A decision to call Child Protective Services because of perceived abuse and neglect can alter the course of a family's trajectory for generations, while harming the child we are supposed to be protecting. Although we don't intend to harm, in fact, our intention is to help, we make this call based on our own biases and cultural perceptions. These biases assume that state-sanctioned intervention will be healthier, safer, and better than the self-determination and interdependence of this child's family and community. We assume that whiteness, both our own and that of the state, will ultimately help, despite a historic precedent that most state intervention has caused harm and disenfranchised communities of color. The disproportionate funneling of Black and brown youth out of schools and into the juvenile system, the removal of Indigenous children from their communities, and forced placement in boarding schools and foster homes, the separation and detention of immigrant children from their families. These are all recent policies with histories embedded in the belief that whiteness knows best. Because of our institutional proximity and this history of racism, when we are following our job descriptions as competent managers, we are often upholding a racist status quo. White supremacy's tools of self-flagellation, guilt, coercion, and individualism will not dismantle racism, but we can learn to courageously hold ourselves and each other accountable with a compassion and love that is unflinchingly honest about harm, that is unapologetic about the repair and transformation needed, and that is clear about the personal and collective power we do have to help make that happen. This is healing work, too. As Audre Lorde says, "For the master's tool will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us temporarily to beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change." However, the last part of her powerful words usually gets left out. And this fact is only threatening to those women who still define the master's house as their only source of support. One of my early book title drafts was "We White Women Are Everywhere." Decided against it because it also sounded kind of threatening. But we are. So what are we going to do with this access and overrepresentation? What slowing down, listening, learning, and unlearning will it take? White Women Get Ready is a complement, not a substitute, to learning from those most impacted and those most equipped. But it is a critical complement, a point of intervention, because if we are honest about how we are part of the problem, then we can get clearer about how to be part of the solution. Oh, that was going to be my next slide. Okay. Let's take a breath in. Hold it. And a big breath out. How about another one? Breath in. Hold it. Long breath out. This time, see if you can get more of your body involved. Maybe a breath in. You might bring your arms up. You might stand up. Oh, that could be revolutionary. And then a big breath out. And then a little shake, a little wiggle. We hold trauma in our connective tissues, in between our joints. Please move your body in a small way. And, oh, we have 10 minutes for questions. Let's see, what else do I want to say about this book? I wrote a book, and there's 4 sections. The first section is deep cuts. So it's the building the foundational analysis and the history. That's mostly what I was talking about today. The second section, I was also referencing a little bit, is about white women archetypes. So there's 5 that I look at: the good plantation wife, vixen mistress, damsel in distress, white savior, and great white mother. The third section is up close and personal, where I share more and more stories about my family systems, family of origin, intimate partner relationships, chosen family in the organizing spaces I've been in. And then the last section is called post-traumatic growth, and it's moving in, again through story, into how we can be more solutions-based, or to use Grace Lee Boggs' term, solutionary. Yeah? Okay. Do you have questions that you want to ask? There's a fancy pants mic over here, which I think is for questions. Is that correct? Yes.
When I was reading that chapter in Resistance, and I was reading a little bit more about you, you say that you like having coffee with lots of white women. And so I'm curious more about your community organizing strategies and how you're connecting with these white women.
Yeah, so I lived in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania for 13 years, and I was very connected to this anti-racist Raja Yoga community. Felicia Savage Friedman wrote the foreword to my book. She's a Black woman who was a mentor of mine and also one of my colleagues and accountability partners. And so I ended up having a lot of coffee dates with white women because she and other Black women in my life kept sending them my way. So that's how it started. And then A colleague of mine was also directing a youth program, so I worked for a Quaker organization, and we were organizing youth, high school, and college age to dismantle the school-to-prison pipeline. And she realized, as I did, how many white women were in these like roles as their school teachers, counselors, running youth programs like we were. And so rather than having so many one-on-one, which that gets exhausting, we started to do some more group work. So I've been facilitating anti-racist affinity spaces for white women, which used to be connected to that organizing, and now because there's a book, it looks more like a book discussion group. So that's one of the ways I've done some anti-racism coaching with, I like to use the term status quo and passing white ladies, because there are a lot of folks who can access that identity who maybe have folks in their own lineage who weren't white, and also, have various relationships to gender. But especially if you can pass as a status quo white lady, then this book is speaking to that experience. Yes?
Sorry. So your background includes connections to social justice, legacies through your Mennonite upbringing, and training with yoga roots that I was reading in the book, the first chapter. So as a Muslim woman, faith is central to my identity and activism. How did your spiritual or cultural background shape your approach to anti-racism in the book? And how can white women engage with their spiritual dimensions of anti-racist work to connect with faith-driven communities like mine?
Yes, so I grew up in Atlanta in the 80s and 90s and was in a Mennonite household where there's a range of theologies, both in my household and also in my home congregation. But I would say the Mennonites in Atlanta overall have a very social justice foundation. And so I grew up with a really strong connection to like Anabaptism as having this peace teaching. And then also was raised in Atlanta. It's the birthplace of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and Jr., and had a lot of like civil rights era activists who came from faith backgrounds, were like visited my school. I mean, it really was an incredible upbringing now that I reflect back on it. And so faith was like a key part of the civil rights movement, and that's how I was raised. So I would say that those foundations, those threads carry me through. It's why I do this work. And I think it's what I draw on in moments when there is a lot of fear, like right now, especially in the US and what's happening, and that courage comes from drawing on my lineage and my faith. There's a really great article that I'm not going to remember right this moment, but Scott Nakagawa has the anti-authoritarian playbook, and he wrote an article about why people of faith are crucial to this moment of anti-authoritarianism, and just like that we need an alternative narrative and rhetoric and grounding to fascism, especially right now. And that's a really great resource, which I can think of it and share it with you later. Mm-hmm. Other questions or comments?
Okay. I'm not that tall. Okay. My question is on the structural change, and I just want to base it on that mistress syndrome applying to white women in leadership. So my question is, what institutional or systems level changes Yeah, so, oh, it's on, it's back on. Okay, thank you. So I was basing it on the mistress syndrome that is applying to white women in leadership positions. So what sort of institutional or systems level changes would you most likely want to see white women push for in education, policy, basically in their communities? Thank you.
Hello? Yeah? Okay. So a lot of my work, one-on-one work with white women, is recognizing where we have institutional access to leverage systemic change, especially like within the education system. So I can't speak specifically to the Canadian context, but in the US, we were doing a lot of shifting discipline policy. So the campaign that I organized with Youth On was the high school students going through the discipline policy in their school, and based on their experience and their experiences of their classmates, making recommendations to shift the policy. And so our big win was that we got Pittsburgh Public Schools to stop suspending kindergartners through second graders, which it's already like ridiculous. Why are we suspending 5-year-olds? But ending school suspension was like a policy shift. So I think there's like all of these policy shifts that we can do. Personally, I'm an abolitionist. I'm a prison industrial complex abolitionist. So I don't think that there is a way forward to collective liberation through these structures. And also, I think that we absolutely need policy shift now because it's impacting people's lives, right? So that's one example of a policy shift that we were working on. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Other questions? Okay. No? Yes. Oh, 2 more.
So one of the things that I've heard often is a feeling of overwhelm at the enormity of when you look at systems change, and then sort of throwing up the hands, well, what can I possibly do? And so, I mean, you mentioned the work of examining where the access to structural power is. In conversations that we're navigating on our own, maybe, what other suggestions do you have to think about breaking down the magnitude of all of the systems that are so problematic?
Oh, this just made me really sad, because I think one of the ways that whiteness traumatizes white body folks and everybody else is the individualism, that we think that we have to come up with solutions to complex problems on our own and like do that on our own. And so we are socialized and conditioned to not seek each other out and to not be able to have authentic relationships and sustain through the conflicts that are inevitably going to happen when we try to organize hard things. And so we end up being more and more isolated. And I think that that's like one of the reasons why the group work has been so important, is because especially white-bodied folks need to start co-creating alternative cultures where we can like be real with each other and experience joy and increase our windows of tolerance for doing really, really difficult, hard things and experiencing fear, right? Like be afraid and not have that completely immobilize us or shut us down. So I think my answer to your question is like, do it with other people. Yeah. And it's okay to not know what you're doing, like, or to not have an answer. Like perfectionism also, like, I think really trips white ladies up. Jonathan, did you have a question? You looked like you really did. Oh no, you're gonna close us out. Oh, he's signaling that we're almost done. Okay, I have one more thing I wanna do, is that okay? If you didn't ask a question, that's cool. You might still have one. So I am going to invite you to turn to the person next to you and say either a question that you have or something that's like still a curiosity or lingering. Yeah? Okay, 1 minute each for each person. What you have is all right. I really appreciate y'all coming out and spending this time and listening to my words. So Jonathan's going to close this out, and then happy to have more conversation or put my fancy pants signature in your book if you're into that kind of thing.
Thank you very much for being with us here and sort of attaching this event to the other reasons that you're going to be circulating in the community of Winnipeg for the next few days. We hope your time here is rich and you feel welcomed and invited in to deeper conversation. When we were living in Seattle for 15 or so years, we had a chance to participate in the European Descent Movement, the DISSENT movement. Which always reminded me in those spaces how whiteness is a co-opted identity of privilege. It promises access to resources and advancement as we navigate and do not question then the systems that uphold the architecture of oppression in which we move and breathe and live. Whiteness knows best. So thank you for calling us in and calling us in. Not just calling us out, calling us in and offering us some handholds towards becoming an embodied, concrete community of contrast is what is so desperately needed in these times, and to be a community of resistance. So thank you. If you're interested in hearing Amanda preach, she's going to be in my church, Charleswood Mennonite Church, on Sunday morning at 10:45. You're welcome to come again and hear Amanda again in a different sort of context. Thank you all for coming, in person and online. Thank you to Common Word again and to CMU for hosting this event. And as our dear friend and colleague and inspiration to many of us, Sarah Augustine, always reminds us of, the answer to despair is knowing that we are not alone. We are collective. We are not alone. Go in peace.